Lando Norris didn't just beat Max Verstappen to a world championship. He beat the one rival who almost destroyed his career from the inside, his own mind. This is the same driver people called too soft, too emotional, the guy who cracked under pressure and fell 34 points behind his own teammate. And yet, somehow, he's the one lifting the trophy. Tonight, we're not asking if Lando is faster than Max. We're asking how a kid who doubted himself turned into the calmest man on the grid when it mattered most. Lando Norris didn't just beat Max Verstappen to a world championship. He beat the one rival who almost destroyed his career from the inside, his own mind. This is the same driver people called too soft, too emotional, the guy who cracked under pressure and even dropped 30-plus points behind his own teammate. And yet he's the one standing on the podium in Abu Dhabi as world champion. Tonight, we're not asking if Lando is faster than Max. We're asking a much harder question. How did a kid who doubted himself turn into the calmest man on the grid when it mattered most? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going deep inside Lando Norris's 2025 season. Not just the stats, not just the race wins, but the mental war that nobody sees. Because if you only watched the final race, you'd think this was straightforward. Third place under the lights in Abu Dhabi, enough points to edge Verstappen and Piastri, McLaren's first driver's title since 2008, Norris becoming the 35th world champion in Formula One history. But listen to his voice after the race, watch his body language in the interviews, and you realize very quickly, this wasn't the story of a guy who simply blew everyone away. This was someone who spent an entire year trying to prove to himself that he actually deserved to be up there. When the checkered flag dropped, the world saw the usual scenes. Norris climbing out of the car, climbing on top of the McLaren, fists in the air, the orange wave in the grandstands, fireworks above Yas Marina, his engineer's voice cracking over the radio. World champion, mate. World champion. But the part that tells the real story isn't the shouting. It's the moment right after. The silence in his helmet. The way he hesitates before he answers. The way he keeps saying we instead of I. In that pause, you can hear years of doubt, failed chances, near misses, social media criticism, and internal pressure finally letting go. Because for Lando, this championship didn't start in 2025. It started with a kid in a cart, watching Formula One on TV with his parents and just wanting one thing: to make them proud. In his post-race reflections, he barely talked about proving people wrong on the grid. He talked about his mom, his dad, his siblings, the long hours, the sacrifices, the fact that his family spent years building a life around his racing dream. That's why, when he finally becomes world champion, and the first thing he says is that this is for his parents and his team, it doesn't sound like media training. It sounds like someone who knows exactly how many people had to bend their lives to put him in that seat. And that's what makes the early part of 2025 so brutal. Because on paper, it looked like the perfect start. He wins the first race in Australia. The narrative flips instantly. This is finally Lando's year. But straight after that comes the storm. Mistakes in qualifying, messy races, a run from round 2 to round 6 where nothing feels clean. Small errors, big consequences. A lockup here, a misjudged move there, a weekend where the car is fast enough but the lap just doesn't come together. Every driver has bad patches, but for Norris, this wasn't just about results. Every mistake fed a voice that had been with him since the first missed opportunity years ago. Maybe you're just the guy who gets close, not the guy who finishes the job. Everyone else could see the numbers. Analysts were talking about a McLaren that, across the season, was the fastest car overall. More traction, more downforce. Strong almost everywhere. For some people, that became a weapon against him. Of course he's in the fight. Look at the car. Give that McLaren to Max and the title's done by summer. Lando's good, but he's not a killer. Those lines weren't just thrown around on Twitter. They were coming from ex-drivers, pundits, columnists. Imagine hearing that every single week while you're still trying to fix your own issues. Imagine knowing that every time you fail to convert pole, the story isn't tough day, it's this guy can't handle a title fight. And then there was Oscar Piastri. If Max Verstappen was the big shadow in the distance, Oscar was the one standing right next to him under the same roof. Calm, ruthless, efficient, the kind of driver who doesn't waste many opportunities. There came a point in the season when the championship table was almost mocking Norris. Piastri in front, Max still looming, and Lando more than 30 points behind his own teammate. 34 points down. In any other context, that would be the moment where you mentally let go of the title and reset for the next year. And honestly, a lot of people thought that's exactly what would happen. They expected him to crumble quietly, grab some consolation podiums, and accept that maybe he just wasn't built for the pressure. But this is where the story flips. Because what Lando actually did in that moment tells you much more about him than the final points tallies. He didn't feel relief. He didn't think, okay, pressure's gone, I can relax. He's admitted since that the gap to Oscar made everything worse. The scrutiny, the tension, the self-doubt. It wasn't about Max anymore. It was about the fear of being the other guy at McLaren for the rest of his career. So instead of shrinking, he did something that most fans never see and most drivers don't like to admit. He went looking for help. Not just for more front wing, not just for a different setup, but help with himself. He expanded his support network, brought in more specialists, more people focused not on the car but on the brain driving it. Performance coaches, mental experts, people who could sit down with him and go, "Why do you tighten up before that last Q3 run? Why does one mistake in Sector 1 ruin the rest of the lap in your head? Why does dropping behind in the points make you overdrive instead of reset?" That's not glamorous. You can't capture that in a slow-motion overtake. But that work is the difference between a talented driver and a champion. From the outside, fans and media started to notice only the output. Fewer mistakes, more control, calmer radio messages, better decision-making in high-pressure moments. On the inside, the process was ugly and slow. It meant confronting things he didn't like about himself. The tendency to spiral after one bad corner, the way criticism from outside stuck in his head, the frustration that turned into over-aggression or hesitation at exactly the wrong time. Piece by piece, he started turning those weaknesses into something else. Not into strengths overnight, but into things he could manage instead of things that controlled him. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen remained the benchmark in the background. 4 titles. Psychological warfare on lock. A driver who builds his legend partly by making other drivers feel small. The whole grid knows what it feels like to be on the receiving end of Max's pace and pressure. Before 2025, plenty of people, including Norris himself at times, bought into the idea that Max was almost untouchable, especially in a straight fight. But here's the twist. When Lando finally found a way through this season, he didn't do it by trying to become a Verstappen clone. He didn't suddenly start dive-bombing people just to send a message. He stayed stubbornly, almost annoyingly, himself. He said it in his own words. He wanted to win in a fair and honest way. He could have been more aggressive. He could have turned into a villain, leaned into the dark arts narrative, squeezed people off track and called it hard racing. But that's not his wiring. And for a long time, that made people think he wasn't serious enough. What 2025 proved is that there's another way to win a title. You can do it by showing up every single weekend with enough pace, enough consistency, and enough mental resilience not to implode when things go wrong. Verstappen's dominance in the past came from intimidating people off the road. Norris's title came from refusing to be intimidated by his own reflection. The second half of the season became a test of that new version of Lando. There were still bad moments. Weekends where strategy didn't click, where Oscar looked sharper, where Max pulled something special out of nowhere. But the difference was what happened next. Earlier in his career, one bad Sunday might have lived in his head for weeks. In 2025, the bounce back got faster. The mistakes didn't vanish, but the recovery did. That's what put him back into the title fight quietly, one race at a time. Until suddenly, by the time we reached Abu Dhabi, he wasn't the guy clinging on. He was the one everyone else had to beat. And then came that final night under the lights. Abu Dhabi wasn't some all-or-nothing, last-lap overtake masterpiece. It was something subtler, a stress test of everything he'd learned. He didn't need to win the race. He needed to not lose the championship. Traffic, defensive driving from rivals with nothing to lose, strategic risk from teams trying to throw him off, all of it was designed to push him into a mistake. Old Lando might have tried to force something, panicked in dirty air, overcooked a move and thrown it away. 25. Lando did something more boring and infinitely harder. He kept his head. Lap after lap, he managed tires, temperatures, and risk. He didn't let the fact that Max was still mathematically dangerous, or that Oscar was right there in the mix, pull him out of his rhythm. He let the race come to him. When the team told him what he needed to do, what minimum position would seal the title, what gaps mattered, where the danger really was, he listened, absorbed, executed. It wasn't highlight reel heroics. It was the final, decisive proof that he'd finally learned to drive not just with his hands and feet, but with a calm mind in a sport that actively tries to rip that calm away from you. So when he finally stepped onto that podium, trophy in hand, anthem playing, it wasn't the look of a man who just crushed Max Verstappen and silenced everyone forever. It was the look of someone who had spent years carrying the weight of, maybe I'm not enough, and for one golden season, proved to himself that he is. His interviews afterwards weren't about being the best on earth or sending messages to rivals. He went back to the same things he started with: his family, his engineers, his mechanics, the people at the factory who missed family dinners to work on his car. He talked about wanting them to be proud, about not wanting this title to change who he is, about hoping he could stay the same Lando even with a number 1 on the car. And that's where the real story of 2025 sits. Not in the comparison charts, not in the talking points about whether Max respected him enough, or whether Oscar was faster on raw pace on certain weekends. The true shift happened somewhere inside Lando Norris himself. He stopped letting the fear of failing define him. He stopped trying to impersonate a more ruthless version of a champion, and instead leaned fully into being the best possible version of who he already was. In a paddock that loves to talk about killers and mentality monsters, he proved there's space for a different kind of strength. The strength to admit your weaknesses, work on them, and still walk into the biggest race of your life knowing that, whatever happens, you're not running from yourself anymore. People will keep arguing in the comments and on TV panels. Max is still the benchmark. Oscar will get him next year. The McLaren made the difference. That debate will never end. But when you strip all of that away, one thing is clear. In 2025, Lando Norris did something far more difficult than just beating another driver over a season. He beat the version of Lando Norris that had been holding him back for years, and that's why this title, whatever happens next, will always mean more than just one line on a list of world champions.